Teacher told black janitor to solve calculus as a joke. Has no idea she's a math genius. It was a typical day at Jefferson High School, and yet something was about to happen that would change everything. No one saw it coming, least of all Mary Jackson, the janitor. To them, she was invisible. To them, she was just an older black woman with calloused hands and a humble position in life, scrubbing floors and cleaning classrooms. But that morning, as Mr. Anderson, the self-proclaimed genius of the math department, looked at her with a mocking smirk, he had no idea that he was about to challenge something far greater than his ego could handle. The entire class waited with bated breath as he slyly handed her the chalk, daring her to solve a problem on the board that had stumped even the brightest students. His voice rang out with a taunting edge. "Come on, Mary, show us what you've got. I'm sure you've been eavesdropping on my lessons. Let's see if you can crack this one." The laughter was instant, echoing throughout the classroom as his challenge was met with sneers and giggles. No one took her seriously. To them, this was just a joke. They expected Mary to shrink away, head bowed, maybe even embarrassed by the ridicule. She'd been invisible to them for so long, they didn't realize that this time they were about to make a huge mistake. Mary Jackson wasn't like the others. The years of being ignored, belittled, and written off had worn her down, yes, but they hadn't broken her. For nearly 2 decades she had arrived before the first bell, sweeping the halls, scrubbing every corner, and cleaning classrooms, while the students and teachers alike ignored her presence. Every day she did her job with quiet dignity, enduring the cold stares, the whispered comments, the assumptions made about her simply because of her job, her age, and the color of her skin. She was the janitor, and to most of them that was all she would ever be. The students passed her by like a shadow, unaware of the depth of her history, the strength of her character, or the brilliance she had once displayed as a young woman. They never knew that Mary had been a promising math student at Columbia University, excelling in complex calculus and piquing the interest of her professors. But life had been cruel. Her father's accident, the weight of financial hardships, and the oppressive prejudice she faced as a black woman had forced her to abandon her dreams and take up the menial work that was the only thing available to her. So Mary did what she had to do. She accepted the role life had dealt her, never questioning it, and quietly endured. But her dreams hadn't been fully erased. They lay dormant, buried deep beneath the surface, hidden away for fear of reopening old wounds. And then, this moment. Mr. Anderson's sarcastic challenge was the spark that would ignite something inside her. The students, who had never bothered to even look her in the eye, now turned their attention fully to her. The room filled with laughter, and Mary could feel the sting of their mockery deep in her heart. The cruel jabs, the dismissive stares, all aimed at her because of her appearance and her job. They thought she was nothing more than a woman too old to understand math, too simple to know anything beyond her broom and mop. But in that instant, something shifted. The anger she had buried for so long, anger not just at the mockery but at the injustice of it all, began to rise. She could feel the weight of years of prejudice pressing down on her shoulders, but she also felt something stronger, something more powerful than she'd felt in decades. It was a sense of defiance. She would not let them define her anymore. With each passing second, the laughter around her faded into the background, and the familiar equations she had once mastered came rushing back into her mind. She had always been a genius. She had never lost that. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the board. Her movements were deliberate, calm, despite the flurry of thoughts racing through her mind. The chalk felt familiar in her hand as she stood before the blackboard, ready to confront the challenge. The eyes of the students were on her, their mockery replaced with curiosity and doubt. Mr. Anderson's smirk was still plastered on his face, but it began to fade as he watched Mary's poised stance, the way she held herself as if she had done this 1,000 times before. And she had. Her fingers wrapped around the chalk, and the first mark on the board was a moment of clarity. The complex equations and symbols on the board, the ones that had stumped her colleagues, began to unfold in front of her. The problem that had been so daunting to the students now seemed almost laughable as she worked through the solution. Her movements were fluid, precise, each step calculated. The room had gone quiet. What had started as a joke was now something entirely different. The students, who had expected failure, were now watching in awe. Mr. Anderson, standing with his arms crossed, his earlier smugness slowly turning into something more akin to worry, realized that he had miscalculated. His challenge was meant to humiliate, to reinforce his sense of superiority, but instead it had opened a door into a world that no one had expected. As Mary continued to write on the board, the students' whispers of disbelief turned into murmurs of admiration. The brilliance they had never seen in her, the talent they had never imagined, was unfolding before their eyes. They were seeing her as she truly was, not the janitor, not the stereotype, but a woman who possessed an extraordinary intellect. The chalk hit the board again, another stroke, and the answer came into focus. Mary wasn't just solving a math problem, she was dismantling years of prejudice, piece by piece. The final mark on the board brought the room to complete silence. There it was, the solution, clean and flawless. Mary took a step back and looked at the board, her eyes scanning the problem one last time to ensure she had done it correctly. She had. The class stood motionless, unable to process what had just happened. In that moment, Mr. Anderson's face turned pale. He had expected her to fail, but instead she had proven him, and everyone in that room, wrong. His gaze flicked to Mary, and he found himself speechless, humbled in a way he had never imagined possible. Mary had done something far more profound than solving a complicated math problem. She had shattered a wall that had stood between her and the world for so long. For the first time in years, she had stood up for herself, and she had done it in the most unexpected way, through her brilliance. The respect that she had quietly longed for, the dignity she had quietly demanded, was now hers. She wasn't just the janitor anymore. She was a symbol of intellect, a symbol of defiance, a symbol of resilience in the face of prejudice. She had done it, and the world around her had no choice but to see her for who she truly was. The silence in the room was deafening. Every student, every teacher, even Mr. Anderson himself, stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the blackboard. It wasn't just the complexity of the problem on the board that had them stunned. It was the realization that the woman standing before them, the janitor who had been the target of their ridicule for so long, was the one who had solved it. With effortless precision, Mary had unraveled the math puzzle that even their brightest minds had struggled with. As the last chalk mark settled onto the board, the tension in the room was palpable. The laughter that had erupted moments before had disappeared entirely, replaced by a heavy silence that stretched for what felt like an eternity. Mary didn't need to look at the students to know that their perception of her had completely shifted. She could feel it. The weight of their gaze no longer filled with mockery, but with something else, something they had never directed at her before. Awe, respect, perhaps even fear. And yet, as the room held its collective breath, Mary remained composed. The answer was right there in front of them, clear, accurate, a flawless solution. But for Mary, it was more than just a mathematical answer. It was a victory, a quiet, personal triumph that no one could take from her. Mr. Anderson stood across the room, his arms still crossed, his face pale and expressionless. The arrogance that had once radiated from him, that belief that he was the smartest person in the room, was gone. His confidence had been shattered, stripped away by a woman who, by all accounts, was supposed to be nothing more than the janitor. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He blinked several times as if trying to process what had just occurred, but nothing made sense. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had expected Mary to be humiliated, to fail in front of the class. He had hoped to prove, once again, his intellectual superiority over her, a woman who, in his eyes, had no place in the academic world. But now she had proven him wrong. In front of everyone, she had shown that intellect was not defined by appearance or profession. She had proven that a person's worth could not be measured by the color of their skin or the job they held. And for the first time, Mr. Anderson was the one left questioning his own worth, his own assumptions, his own prejudice. As he stood there, dumbfounded, the students' eyes began to shift from the board to Mary. The awe in their eyes was palpable. They had expected failure, but instead they had witnessed something extraordinary. Some of them were too stunned to speak. Others exchanged glances as if wondering how they could have been so wrong about her. They had spent so many years walking past her, ignoring her presence, assuming that she was nothing more than the quiet, humble janitor. But now they saw her in a completely different light. They saw her for who she truly was, a woman of intellect, a woman of strength, a woman who had endured far more than any of them could imagine. And that, in itself, was a lesson they would never forget. Mary didn't wait for applause or validation. She wasn't looking for praise. The moment she had spent years silently hoping for had arrived, and she knew, deep down, that this wasn't about her. It wasn't about the recognition or the fame. It was about breaking free from the chains that had bound her for so long. It was about proving to herself that she still had the fire within her, the brilliance that had once burned so brightly at Columbia University, before it had been buried under the weight of societal expectations and racial prejudice. For years, Mary had accepted the role that others had cast her in. She had accepted the label of janitor and lived with the assumption that her worth was tied to that, but today she had broken free from that. Today she had proven to herself and to the world that she was so much more than that. As the room continued to sit in stunned silence, Mary set the chalk down and turned to face the class. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her expression was calm, her gaze steady and unwavering. The students, still processing what they had just witnessed, continued to watch her. Mary didn't need to say a word. Her silence spoke volumes. She had already shown them everything they needed to know. She had proven that intelligence was not a matter of status, skin color, or job. It was a matter of the mind, the heart, and the will to push beyond what others thought you could be. As Mary quietly left the room, the whispers began. It wasn't just the students who were talking about her. The story of the janitor who had solved the impossible math problem quickly spread through the school like wildfire. In the halls, in the cafeteria, in the classrooms, it was all anyone could talk about. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had witnessed her brilliance. Even the students who had once mocked her, who had snickered behind her back, were now in disbelief. How could they have missed it? How could they have been so blind? Mary Jackson wasn't just a janitor. She was a genius. And as the whispers turned into admiration, Mary's quiet victory began to take root. The respect she had always longed for was now hers, but she wasn't interested in the applause. She didn't need to hear their words. She didn't need the validation. What mattered to her was that she had stood up for herself. She had defied their expectations. She had shown them the true power of resilience. She had proven that no one, no matter their background, no matter their job, should ever be underestimated. That night, as Mary sat alone in her small apartment, the weight of the day finally began to settle on her. She had faced years of prejudice, years of discrimination, and yet she had never let it define her. Today had been the moment when everything changed, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever looked down on her. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel proud, proud of her intellect, proud of the woman she had become despite the odds stacked against her. But there was something else, something deeper. Mary wasn't just proud of the math problem she had solved. She was proud of the way she had held her ground, proud of the way she had refused to shrink into the background, proud that she had finally proven that no one, not even the people who had ignored her, could take away her worth. She had spent years hiding in the shadows, but now she was stepping into the light, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, as Mary entered the school once again, the atmosphere had changed. The students no longer ignored her. They didn't pass by with their usual indifference. This time, there were nods of recognition, smiles, and even some words of gratitude. It was subtle at first, but it was there. It wasn't just the students who had noticed. The teachers too were beginning to see her in a new light. As she walked through the halls, Mary could feel their eyes on her, no longer filled with disdain or disregard. There was respect in those glances. She wasn't just the janitor anymore. She was Mary Jackson, the woman who had shown them all what it meant to be truly brilliant. She wasn't invisible anymore, and she wasn't going to let them forget it. Mary had done something that most people never get the chance to do. She had broken down the walls that had kept her hidden for so long. And now, as the days passed, those walls began to crumble for everyone around her. People who had once mocked her now had no choice but to acknowledge her. But Mary wasn't interested in their apologies. What mattered to her was the lesson they had learned. What mattered was the way they had been forced to confront their own biases. She had used her brilliance to tear down the prejudices that had kept her confined to the shadows for so long. And in doing so, she had made them see that intelligence isn't about the job you have or the color of your skin. It's about the depth of your mind, the strength of your heart, and the courage to stand up for who you truly are. The room remained unnervingly quiet. The chalk still lingered on the board, the last mark fresh, yet it felt like time had stopped entirely. As Mary stood there, her back to the class, she could feel the weight of the students' gaze bearing down on her, but she didn't turn around to face them. She didn't need to. The moment was too powerful, too significant, for her to even entertain the thought of looking for validation. She had already proven everything she needed to prove. The answer on the board spoke for itself, clear and precise, leaving no room for argument. Yet, behind her, the atmosphere was thick with disbelief. The students who had once snickered at her presence, the ones who had dismissed her as invisible, now sat frozen, unable to speak. They had witnessed something extraordinary, and for the first time, they understood the weight of their assumptions. Mary Jackson wasn't just a janitor. She wasn't just the woman who cleaned their classrooms or swept their hallways. She was someone far greater than they could have ever imagined. And as the silence stretched on, a sense of awe settled over the room. Mary wasn't just a figure they had overlooked. She was a woman who had just dismantled their ignorance with nothing but her intellect. Mr. Anderson stood at the front of the room, his arms crossed, still processing what had just occurred. The smugness that had once defined him, that sense of superiority that had made him feel untouchable, was gone. He felt vulnerable, exposed, like a man who had been stripped of his pride. For years, he had prided himself on being the smartest person in the room. He had convinced himself that no one, not even the brightest of his students, could challenge his intellectual authority. And now, this woman, this janitor, had not only solved the problem he had set before her, but she had done it with ease, grace, and confidence. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The realization hit him like a wave, crashing against the walls of his arrogance, leaving him speechless. His eyes flickered toward Mary, who stood calmly in front of the board, her posture composed, her demeanor unwavering. He couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. He had been cruel to her, dismissive, thinking that her status as a janitor meant she was somehow beneath him. But now, looking at her, he saw something else. He saw intelligence, strength, and dignity. He saw someone who had endured years of ridicule and prejudice, but who had never let it define her. And in that moment, he understood something profound. The true measure of a person's worth had nothing to do with their job or their appearance. It had everything to do with who they were at their core. Mary took a deep breath and turned slowly toward the class. The tension in the room had thickened, but it wasn't hostile. It wasn't filled with the same mockery that had characterized the beginning of the lesson. No, now the air was heavy with realization. The students no longer saw her as the janitor. They saw her as an equal, as someone who had proven her worth in the most powerful way possible. Mary's gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of the students who had once looked past her, who had once seen her as nothing more than a laborer in the background. Now their expressions had shifted. The sneers, the indifference, those were gone. What remained was respect. What remained was something that Mary had never asked for but had always deserved. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence, her presence was enough. In her mind she had done what she set out to do. She had shown them that she was not just defined by the title of janitor. She was defined by the strength of her mind, her resilience, and her refusal to let anyone dictate her worth. Mr. Anderson, still struggling to comprehend what had just happened, cleared his throat. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than usual, lacking the authority he once carried. "Mary, that was impressive," he said, his words not coming easily. He wasn't used to admitting when he was wrong, especially not to someone he had once looked down on. But the weight of his own mistake was too great to ignore. I never expected that." Mary didn't respond right away. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the chalkboard, as though processing what had just transpired. She could feel the shift in the room, but she wasn't interested in the superficial acknowledgement. What mattered was that she had made a point, not just to him, but to everyone in that room. She had shown them that intelligence wasn't a privilege. It wasn't something determined by skin color or job title. It was something that transcended those things, something that existed within her regardless of the label they had placed on her. The students, though still processing their shock, began to stir. Whispers of awe and disbelief began to ripple through the room. "Did you see that?" one student murmured. "She really solved it." Another voice, filled with a mixture of awe and shame, added, "She's incredible. I never thought—" The words trailed off, but they didn't need to be finished. The message was clear. Mary Jackson had done the impossible, and in doing so, she had shattered years of prejudice and bias in one fell swoop. The whispers grew louder, but they were no longer mocking. They were filled with respect, admiration, and curiosity. Some students were even looking at Mary with newfound wonder, as if seeing her for the first time. It was a look she had longed for, though she never expected it to come this way. The students, who had once seen her as little more than a figure in the background, now saw her as something more, something greater. They saw her as a person of intellect, of strength, and of dignity. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Mary quietly collected her things. She didn't need to hear the students' newfound admiration. She didn't need their praise. She had already given them the most valuable lesson they would ever receive, the lesson of self-worth, the lesson that a person's value cannot be determined by the job they hold, the color of their skin, or the assumptions others make about them. As Mary made her way to the door, the students' eyes followed her, not with the same indifferent stares from before, but with something else, something that Mary hadn't experienced in years: respect. Outside the classroom, the buzz of students in the hallways grew louder, but Mary paid little attention. She knew what was coming. The story would spread like wildfire. She wasn't just the janitor anymore. She was Mary Jackson, the woman who had solved the impossible problem, the woman who had defied the odds, and the woman who had shown them all that they were wrong. She could feel the shift, the change in the air, and though it was only the beginning, Mary knew one thing for sure: she had made an impact. The school had witnessed something extraordinary, something they could never forget, and it all started with a challenge that no one, not even Mr. Anderson, could have predicted. By the time the day ended, the story had already started to circulate. Students were talking about it in the cafeteria, in the halls, in the locker rooms. It wasn't just the math class anymore. It was everyone. Mary Jackson had changed everything. And though she didn't expect accolades or recognition, she knew that in the hearts and minds of the people around her, something had shifted. She had done more than solve a math problem. She had broken down a wall of ignorance and prejudice, and in doing so she had shown them all that the true measure of a person's worth was not in what they did for a living, but in who they were. The quiet hum of the hallway was interrupted by a soft knock at the door to Mary's janitor's closet. She looked up, surprised. There, standing in the doorway, was Mr. Anderson, looking far from the confident, arrogant man she had once known. His posture was different, no longer the smug, self-assured figure he once was. Now he seemed almost small. His eyes, usually filled with pride, were shadowed with something she hadn't expected, genuine shame. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Mary simply stood, waiting, trying to gauge what he was there for. After a brief silence, Mr. Anderson finally cleared his throat, his voice softer than usual. "Mary, can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked, his words slow, as if carefully chosen. Mary paused, weighing the situation. She had never expected an apology from him, not after all these years of his dismissive attitude, but there was something in his demeanor now that told her this conversation would be different. "Of course," she replied, her voice calm, collected, though a part of her still found it difficult to reconcile this version of Mr. Anderson with the man who had once openly mocked her. He stepped inside, shifting awkwardly as if unsure of how to begin. The janitor's closet, small and cluttered with mops and cleaning supplies, was far removed from the math classroom. It was a world that had never felt important to the academic community that Mary had been a part of so long ago. Yet here they were, in this small space, where the power dynamics had completely flipped. Mr. Anderson took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping slightly as if carrying a heavy weight. "Mary," he started again, "I owe you an apology. What happened today? I've been teaching for years, and I thought I knew everything there was to know, but I was wrong. I made a mistake, and I need to own up to it. I've treated you terribly, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Mary didn't respond immediately. She could feel the sincerity in his words, but it was still hard to process. This wasn't the man who had belittled her for so long. This wasn't the same Mr. Anderson who had looked at her with scorn and disdain, assuming she had no place in a classroom. This was a man who had been forced to confront his own prejudices, someone who had been knocked off his pedestal and had to face the truth of what he had done. She looked at him for a moment, her gaze steady but not unkind. "You were wrong," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But you're not the only one. For years I've been wrong too. I've lived with the weight of assumptions, prejudices, and discrimination. But that doesn't mean I need your apology. What matters is what we do with the lessons we've learned from those mistakes. And today, Mr. Anderson, you've learned something important. We all have." There was a long pause as Mr. Anderson absorbed her words. His face softened, and for the first time he seemed truly reflective, like someone who was seeing beyond their own ego. He nodded slowly, a deep sense of remorse in his eyes. "You're right," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I've spent too much time assuming I knew better than everyone else. I let my pride get in the way of truly seeing people. But today, you taught me something I won't forget. I can't change the past, but I will do my best to be better moving forward." Mary nodded, accepting his apology, but it wasn't for her. It was for him. It was a moment of clarity for both of them, one that Mary knew was bigger than any single apology could encapsulate. She had shown him something more important than intellectual superiority. She had shown him humility. She had shown him the importance of respecting others, regardless of their background, skin color, or occupation. It wasn't just about solving a math problem. It was about breaking down the invisible walls of prejudice that had confined them both. After a few moments of silence, Mary added, "I'm not asking for special treatment, Mr. Anderson, but what I am asking for is that we, all of us, stop judging others by what we see on the surface. I've lived a life of silence, of keeping my talents hidden because I was afraid of how the world would treat me. But today, I made the decision not to let that happen anymore. I don't want to live in fear. I want to live with dignity, and I want everyone to know that dignity has nothing to do with a job title or the color of our skin." Mr. Anderson's eyes met hers, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with genuine respect. "Thank you for showing me what it truly means to see people for who they really are. I won't forget this." Mary simply nodded, and with that, Mr. Anderson turned and left the janitor's closet, leaving Mary alone once again. But she didn't feel alone. In that moment, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. Later that afternoon, as Mary made her way back to her usual duties, something was different. The students no longer passed by her with indifference or mockery. There were nods of acknowledgement, brief smiles, and even words of thanks as they passed her in the hallway. It was subtle, but it was there. And while Mary wasn't interested in the attention, she couldn't help but notice the shift in the atmosphere. The world, it seemed, was finally beginning to see her for who she truly was, a woman of intelligence, strength, and dignity. The next day, the story continued to spread through the school. It wasn't just about Mary solving a math problem anymore. It was about the lessons that had been learned, the prejudices that had been broken down, and the walls of ignorance that had been torn apart. Students who had once mocked her were now sharing her story with their friends, amazed at what she had done, and more importantly, amazed at what they had failed to see in her for so long. The respect that had been absent in the past was now everywhere. It wasn't loud or forceful. It was quiet, subtle, but undeniable. And for Mary, that was enough. She didn't need the recognition or the praise. What mattered was that the truth had come to light. What mattered was that the world around her had learned to see her for who she was, not the janitor, not the stereotype, but a woman of remarkable intellect and undeniable worth. As the days went on, the change was palpable. The students began to treat her differently, not because of her job or her skin color, but because they finally understood what they had been missing. Mary had shown them the value of respect, the importance of looking beyond the surface, and the power of defying expectations. They had learned that a person's worth cannot be measured by the work they do, but by the character they carry within. And as for Mr. Anderson, the change in him was just as profound. No longer the arrogant man he had once been, he became an advocate for the very lessons Mary had taught him. He no longer saw her as just the janitor. He saw her as a peer. He saw her as someone who had earned her place, not because of the role she played in the school, but because of the strength of her mind and the dignity of her spirit. Weeks passed, and as the story of Mary's brilliance continued to spread, it wasn't just the students who were affected. The teachers, too, began to change. They began to look at their students differently, to recognize the biases they had unwittingly held for so long. Conversations about respect, equality, and social justice became more frequent, and for the first time, those discussions weren't just theoretical. They were personal, they were real. And Mary, though still quietly doing her job in the background, had become the symbol of all those changes. She wasn't looking for fame or recognition. She didn't need it. What she needed was to know that the world had learned something valuable, that her years of silence, of enduring prejudice, had not been in vain. Her story had sparked a shift, a new understanding of what it meant to truly respect someone for who they were, not for what they did or how they looked. And though Mary didn't need anyone else to acknowledge her worth, she could feel the change in the way the world saw her. It wasn't about proving herself anymore. It was about knowing, deep down, that she had always been worthy,